Thank you for sharing the slides, Ayomide. I appreciate that. We're going to call the meeting to order now. It is 7:02 on on June 23, and this is a public meeting of the City of Portland Police Accountability Commission. If the Spanish language interpreters, Manuel and Thalia, can please give the information on Spanish language interpretation, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por atender a esta reunión. Vamos a dar unas breves instrucciones por si usted quiere escuchar en su idioma español o el original inglés. Abajo de su pantalla usted va a ver varios iconos, empezando por el micrófono. Usted tiene la cámara. Tiene también yéndose hasta el centro una cajita burbuja del chat y después ahí le va a aparecer un globo o un pequeño mundo. Usted le va a dar clic y ahí usted va a seleccionar su idioma. Si usted prefiere español, va a aparecer como Spanish y tiene que apagar el audio original para no tener interferencias. Si usted quiere el idioma inglés, de igual manera usted va a seleccionar English y por favor asegúrese de apagar siempre el sonido original para que no haya interferencias, y si usted no va a hacer uso de la palabra, mantenga apagado su micrófono o en mute, por favor. Gracias.
Thank you so much. The city also offers ASL interpretation, which is being provided by Andrea and Amanda. You can pin their video feed if that is helpful to you. Finally, the closed captioning is turned on in Zoom as another means of assistance. But please note, this is an automatic captioning service and it is not always accurate. The city supports access to meetings of the Police Accountability Commission and can provide other language support as well. Please email in advance of future public meetings, either as a response to a public meeting notice or directly to policeaccountability@portlandoregon.gov to ask for other access assistance, including interpretation into other languages. The meeting is a public meeting subject to the City of Portland Administrative Code and the Oregon state law, and is being recorded. For this meeting, the chat function is enabled for commission members to communicate with each other. Members of the public will also be able to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. As the commissioners are presenting and or discussing things, if attendees have questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A. And we hope the use of this feature is helpful to guide our conversation during the meeting and future meetings and agenda topics. We'd like to be clear that not all questions will be answered during the meeting, but if answered, both the questions and the answers will be visible to you and will become part of the meeting record. To access this feature, we click on the Q&A icon in the middle of the screen. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Thank you so much for the land acknowledgement. The purpose of our land acknowledgement is to center the traditional Native inhabitants upon the land which we live. We want to respectfully acknowledge the Chinook, the Clatskanie, the Kalapuya, and the Multnomah and the Clackamas, the two tribal nations who are missing from the map, who are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. They're missing from the map because of the genocide that occurred in the creation of this country. We honor those who have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we pay our respects to their elders, both past and present. May we move to the next slide, please? And these are our community agreements. I would like and invite you to read through the community agreements. And I just want to note that the Spanish interpretation is now active. Next slide, please. The second half of our community agreements. Thank you so much, Aimide. I'm going to turn the meeting over now to our co-chairs who are going to discuss the timeline.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Simab Husseini. I'm a co-chair in this fact-finding phase for the City of Portland's Police Accountability Commission. Basically, the commission, as I said, is currently in the fact-finding phase of work, expected to go into August. It includes hearing from key stakeholders, identifying barriers to accountability in Portland presently, and examining systems of accountability from other jurisdictions.
Y hay otras jurisdicciones que tienen credibilidad.
Yeah, sorry, Manuel, I believe that you are on. Could you please mute your, yes, thank you so much. So I think we may be able to continue to move forward. Manuel, are you all set with the interpretation? No, you are having a technical issue with the interpretation.
I can go sentence by sentence.
Sorry, you have not assigned us. It hasn't show up on my screen to choose the Spanish channel.
It would be at the very bottom, the little globe at the very bottom, interpretation.
Yeah. No, it still doesn't show on my screen. That's why I cannot select going to the Spanish channel.
I understand that Thalia is in it, so that is, you're fine. And I'm sorry to interrupt, Simab.
No, you're fine. I want to be able to make sure Manuel is squared away as well. Are we good now?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Good. Okay. So, just you know, it also includes increased community engagement work. Future phases of work will develop the parameters for a new police accountability system before the commission presents that to the City Council in 2023 for their consideration and approval.
Next slide.
There we go. And following today's meeting, here are the next several upcoming meetings of the commission. The subcommittee on research will meet next Monday, then again in mid-July. The subcommittee on community engagement events will meet next in mid-July, and the full commission will continue to meet and hold briefings next Thursday with the City Commissioner Ryan and the Police Review Board coordinator. On July 11th with Mental Health Alliance and amicus to the settlement agreement. July 21st with Albino Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform, who is another amicus, as well as City Commissioner Rubio, continuing into late July.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Now, this slide is the current project plan for the fact-finding phase of the Police Accountability Commission's work. As you'll see highlighted right there in June, in yellow is exactly where we're at. It's not their agendas and it's not set in stone. This slide is mostly for members of the public to be able to understand how the commission gets from now through the end of the phase, which focuses on identifying areas of agreement among commission members as to barriers to accountability in the current system. Best practices from Portland and other jurisdictions, and suggestions to consider from experts, as well as taking public comment and meeting with key stakeholders. Today's meeting is in the blue box, as I pointed out for you guys right there in the center screen, highlighted in yellow text and purple border.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. And let's see. All right. I can also cover this screen if need. So today's meeting agenda includes a briefing with Greg Pashley, Acting Captain of Internal Affairs, and Jeff Bell, Commander of the Professional Standards Division at Portland Police Bureau. This briefing consists of 3 parts: a presentation from the chiefs on police accountability and their role in the current system, a Q&A period with police accountability members, Police Accountability Commission members, and our briefers, and then a public comment and questions period where members of the public can give their opinion and ask questions of briefers as well. After the briefing, there will be time for the Police Accountability Commission members to discuss all the briefings we've heard so far and identify what best practices and barriers to police accountability they feel should go into the Police Accountability Commission's areas of agreements document, which are both on the output of this phase of work and the problem statement for the Police Accountability Commission is going to try and fix in future phases. There will also be an open public comment period at the end of the meeting for community members to discuss anything under Police Accountability Commission's agenda or give their stories related to policing and police accountability.
Thank you so very much. I would like to invite Acting Captain Greg Pashley and Commander Jeff Bell to begin their presentation. And thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you very much. Commander Bell is here with me in the office, and after I give a few remarks, I'll turn the camera so that we're both visible for that, for your questions, if that's okay. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak a little bit about internal affairs. As was mentioned, my name is Greg Pashley. I'm a lieutenant with the Police Bureau, currently serving as the acting captain in internal affairs. We're glad to be able to be here to talk about IA and police accountability. Police accountability is something we take very seriously. The Portland Police Bureau works very hard to establish trust with people who we serve. Standards of performance are important. They're an important part of building and maintaining community trust. A system of accountability, which includes policies, training, supervision, a system that includes evaluation and an investigative process, as well as independent oversight of that process, should ensure employees understand and are held to established standards. The process should be open to all complaints and should provide complainants assurance that their complaint will be investigated completely, that their complaint will be investigated objectively and thoroughly. So tonight, I'll talk a little bit about our system, our process, and leave plenty of time for your questions. We did receive a short list of areas of interest for this presentation, and so I want to be sure to address those. The directives governing the complaint and investigative process, as well as the process of review and discipline or corrective action, are all available online. Hopefully, many of you have had a chance to read those directives, as I will definitely not be able to cover every detail of our system of accountability in the few short minutes that we have together this evening. Before I answer or we get to the question and answers, I just want to address the topics that we were asked to cover. And for those who may not know what those are, here's what they were. First, the internal affairs role in the current accountability system, from intake to final disciplinary decisions to appeals. Second, how IA works with the independent police review and other parts of the current system. Third, barriers to police accountability in the current system. And then after that, best practices in the current system. So first, the role of internal affairs within the current accountability system, from intake to disciplinary decisions to appeals. Internal affairs is an office within the professional standards division of the Portland Police Bureau. Internal affairs is staffed with 1 captain, 1 lieutenant, 2 sergeants, 3 administrative staff employees, and 8 civilian internal affairs investigators. Internal affairs reports to the professional standards division commander, who reports to the chief. Internal affairs manages the investigations from their origin as a complaint through case closure. At all times and at all stages, the cases are monitored by the independent police review. Complaints come in different ways. Many cases begin when a person contacts the independent police review, in which case IPR conducts an intake. Complaints also come in through the police bureau, either when a community member approaches someone in the bureau with their complaint, or when someone within the bureau initiates a complaint against another police bureau member. In Portland, we take complaints from individuals who have a complaint. We take complaints from witnesses, interested third parties. We take anonymous complaints. Complaints come in a variety of ways. They may come in person. They might come in via email, tort claims. Someone may call either someone within the police bureau or IPR to make a complaint. There's a variety of ways to initiate a complaint. We try to be very open and available. When a community complaint comes through a police bureau employee, the employee should gather as much information as possible in order to assist the person in making their complaint. The employee should forward that complaint then through their chain of command to internal affairs and to IPR. Complaints are also initiated within the police bureau when a bureau employee makes an allegation of potential misconduct. Depending on the details of the complaint, the information is examined, and internal affairs collaborates with IPR and often with the Bureau of Human Resources to be sure a case is opened and investigated by the correct office. When a complaint comes to internal affairs, the internal affairs lieutenant compares the complaint to police bureau directives to determine what allegations might exist and what police bureau directives apply to the allegations. The lieutenant writes allegations based on what's known and then cross-references those allegations to corresponding directives. Then, and at the same time, gathers information, whatever basic information is known at about the time of the complaint, about the context of the complaint. And so that information could include things like witness information, whatever evidence might be known at the time the complaint is made, documents that might be associated with an incident or event, and anything else that exists at the origin of the complaint. Once a complaint is opened, there's an intake process. Internal Affairs conducts intake often in collaboration with the Bureau of Human Resources in cases where misconduct by a professional staff employee or sometimes they're referred to as non-sworn employees, is alleged. If the alleged is a sworn member of the Portland Police Bureau, IPR does intake when the case is initiated through their office, which is where most complaints begin. Internal Affairs sometimes does information gathering or intake, especially when complaints are initiated from within the Police Bureau. Once a case is opened and is ready for assignment, the lieutenant sends the information to the Internal Affairs sergeants for assignment in one of two directions. Some cases have allegations that, if sustained, would not result in more than something we call command counseling. Those cases are referred to the managers of employees in what are called supervisory investigations. Direct supervisors of employees look into the complaint, speak directly to the complainant if the complainant wishes to speak with them, then speaks to the employee who allegedly violated a directive. The supervisor then contacts the complainant again, if they're available, to talk about the resolution of the case. The supervisor summarizes their work in a supervisory investigation memo back to Internal Affairs with a finding of either substantiated or not substantiated, and explains how the complaint was resolved, often through coaching or counseling. In cases with allegations which, if sustained, could result in discipline, the case is forwarded to Internal Affairs sergeants for assignment to an Internal Affairs investigator. The Internal Affairs sergeant reviews the material and assigns the case to an investigator based on current caseloads. The investigator conducts their investigation, which usually includes interviews of the complainant, witnesses, and employees who have allegedly engaged in misconduct. The allegations as written sometimes change as more information is gathered. Sometimes new allegations emerge as the investigation gets going. Investigators have to seek evidence. They gather evidence ranging from police reports or other Bureau documents, other written documents, video, photographic evidence, phone records, computer records, whatever they can find that is relevant evidence associated with the case. Investigators collaborate with detectives in cases where criminal activity has been alleged. Internal Affairs investigators review all information collected in criminal investigations related to their cases, but do not share any information from the administrative investigation with detectives. In the course of their investigations, investigators may work with professionals outside the Police Bureau, such as other law enforcement agencies or other government agencies or offices, medical providers, lawyers, business owners, community members. Investigators may work with other city employees, other city bureaus, including those, of course, from the Independent Police Review, the City Attorney's Office, Bureau of Information Technology, and others. The investigators work their cases under the supervision of their sergeants, and all cases are discussed at least weekly among the supervisors of Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs meets formally once a week with the Independent Police Review managers to discuss cases, but meets much more often informally in phone conversations, in person, these days via Zoom, to talk about progress of cases. Once an investigator completes their investigation, the case remains open as it works its way through the review process. At any stage, while the case is open, it can be sent back to the investigator for further investigation. When the investigator completes their investigation, they make a recommended finding based on the facts as the facts apply to directives. The options for recommended findings in a full administrative investigation are sustained, not sustained, unfounded, and exonerated using the preponderance of evidence standard. The Internal Affairs sergeant receives the case from the investigator and reviews it. If it's ready, it's submitted simultaneously to the lieutenant at Internal Affairs and to an IPR director. Each of them reviews the case. And if the case is ready at that point, it goes to the manager of the employee for findings. Once the manager reviews the case and comes to their recommended findings, the case and findings are simultaneously reviewed by the Internal Affairs captain and independent police review manager and an assistant chief. With sustained findings, the manager consults a corrective action guide and makes a recommendation for corrective action or discipline based on the guide. When a manager comes to their finding in cases where there are sustained findings with recommended discipline, which could include loss of pay, the Professional Standards Division discipline coordinator is notified and begins the work to convene a police review board. The police review board is a panel which includes a peer member of the employee being investigated, a community member, an independent police review director, the manager of the employee, and an assistant chief. The police review board also has multidisciplinary advisory members present to offer insights into certain aspects of the case if needed. The PRB makes recommended findings, makes recommendations regarding discipline, and may make recommendations regarding policy, training, tactics, or other issues relevant to that case. There's also a window of appeal that opens before a case closes. Appeals are organized by IPR. The chief of police has final say on cases in which discipline may be imposed. The Internal Affairs Division is not involved in recommendations or imposition of corrective action or discipline. Those processes are managed by a discipline coordinator within the Professional Standards Office outside of Internal Affairs. This leaves Internal Affairs free to objectively gather facts and make recommended findings, free from having to come to an opinion about any outcome regarding corrective action. I've talked a little bit about how Internal Affairs works with IPR. So I want to talk about how IPR works as well as other parts of the current system, just very briefly. IPR has oversight of our processes and investigations. I served for a few years as a sergeant in Internal Affairs, and now here as the acting captain. And in my opinion, the relationship has always seemed very collaborative. Our staff and their staff talk frequently about allegations, investigations, all aspects of cases. We share information, we assist each other to accomplish our goals. IPR is the main point of contact for community complaints and intake. And I'll say a little bit more about IPR in a few moments as I discuss best practices. Internal Affairs is not part of the discipline process. That was one of the questions, how we are involved in each stage, including up to the discipline process. Our investigations inform Bureau management about facts relevant to allegations. In cases where discipline is recommended, as I mentioned, IPR acts as an advisory member on the police review board, ready to answer questions about the investigation, but without any sort of vote in recommended corrective action. One of the things we were asked to talk a little bit about are barriers to accountability in the current system. So just a few words on that. You know, one thing I would mention here that I think has been well discussed in other forums and maybe with you is that the lack of a body-worn camera program of any kind in Portland. That's become a fairly standard piece of equipment for police. It serves the community and the police mission as well in a variety of ways. That kind of a tool would be a real plus for everybody involved. In Portland, we've seen glimpses of the benefits of audio and video in limited use mobile vehicle-based video and audio recording systems. Video and audio can provide the fact finder with more information, more evidence that can help them arrive at their findings in conjunction with whatever else is known about a particular case or a particular circumstance or event. Implementing some kind of body-worn camera system in Portland would be a good addition to accountability, and it's my understanding that work is underway in that area. Another potential barrier to accountability is that our process is confusing. Many people don't know how it works. There are a lot of steps, a lot of paths that investigations take, and depending on factors specific to the complaint, there's just lots of ways that these cases work their way toward some end. The system's been built and adapted over years to fit various needs. Since it's complicated, it takes longer than people wish, which can be frustrating to complainants. It can be frustrating to employees. Another possible barrier to accountability in a way is related to the openness of our process. We have, and we complete investigations, even in some cases when the complainant doesn't participate in the investigation. Openness is important, but without a complainant's participation, investigators may lack important access to testimony. They may lack information that a complainant could provide about evidence or witnesses, their own perspective, of course, and may not be able to learn as much as they might had a complainant participated. Another possible barrier to accountability may be just a general lack of understanding of our process, which may give the impression that investigations aren't happening, or that employees aren't held accountable. There are a variety of considerations related to confidentiality and the rights of employees. And while complainants are kept informed of the results of the investigative process, the information they receive is merely a summary of all that is known. And so it may not be completely satisfying, even in cases when their complaint is sustained. Our current system is very open to all complaints, regardless, for the most part, of timeliness. That could be considered a barrier to accountability. Openness isn't a barrier, but the further in time the complaint is from the event or act or circumstance that led to the complaint, the harder it can be to find witnesses or evidence. Memories fade, and so timeliness of complaints is important. We were asked also to speak a little bit about best practices. So let me make a few remarks along those lines. I mentioned timeliness a second ago. That's important in investigations as well. We consider a few best practices, or as we consider, I should say, some best practices. Our investigations are guided by timelines. Each stage of the process is limited to specific timelines, and each case is supposed to be closed within 180 days. We're interested in being thorough, and we don't rush to meet timelines if it means sacrificing thoroughness. In fact, another best practice in our system is that at any stage in the life of a case, the case can be sent back to the investigator for more work. I think I mentioned that earlier as well. The community and the employee deserve cases to be investigated completely. And we do strive to meet timelines, and usually do, but not at the expense of a good investigation. Another best practice, Portland Police internal affairs investigators are all civilians. That's been the case for about 13 years. Their experience as internal affairs investigators ranges from about 13 years in our division to about 1 year in our division. Each investigator who works in our office came to internal affairs with considerable investigative experience. Some were full career police detectives. Most had extensive law enforcement experience, including supervisory experience. Some had prior investigative experience, or they all did, I should say. And they investigated in various disciplines in including sex abuse investigations, homicides, robberies. They all have experience conducting investigations into complex, sensitive, confidential matters, ranging, like I said, from criminal investigations to personnel investigations, financial investigations, administrative investigations. Our investigators, through training and experience, develop an expertise in conducting internal affairs investigations. They develop familiarity with the subject matter. They're knowledgeable about police policies, police training. As civilians, they're assigned to IA specifically. They're free from having to work with or for any of the people that they have to interview and investigate. As full-time, long-serving employees, they develop a really good understanding of the various labor union contracts, laws and rules related to administrative investigations. In addition to that, they just become very familiar with methods and trends in their field of work. Internal affairs investigators, supervisors work hard in this office to maintain a collegial and professional workplace, and our investigators collaborate on their cases. We have 8 of them, and they consult with each other frequently. They discuss investigative and interview techniques and approaches. They share their years of investigative experience with each other. They give each other suggestions as to how to approach an interview. They team up on very complicated cases and perform such just common tasks like proofing each other's work. They share information, they share knowledge, they share experience. And another best practice is our civilian oversight. Anyone who reviews our directives and city code will see that the Independent Police Review has had oversight of investigations into allegations of misconduct by Portland police for a couple decades. IPR offers an independent office which reviews cases. They make recommendations for investigations. They approve all investigations. They approve or disagree with recommended findings. They send cases back for more investigations when needed. They conduct independent investigations related to specific topics or whenever they wish. IPR is the presumptive investigative agency for all complaints about police bureau members at the rank of captain and above. They are the presumptive investigators for allegations stemming from events related to crowd control, as well as any allegations of bias or disparate treatment, or regarding vulnerable complainants. But also any cases of public interest or any other case their office wishes to be the primary investigator on. IPR also acts as the primary point of contact for community complaints, independent of the police. And they act as an independent entity that can compel review by any case to the police review board. In my collected years at Internal Affairs, once again, it's been my experience, especially with IPR directors and managers, that they're dedicated professionals who have a very high regard for police accountability and seem to have the community interest first and foremost in their minds. I mentioned a couple aspects earlier as part of our process, which are considered best practices. One is that investigators, whether internal affairs or independent police review, they make recommended findings. That is a best practice in this industry. The investigators are the people closest to the cases. They're most knowledgeable about the information in the case file. And so they make recommendations for the consideration of fact finders later in the process. Another best practice within our bureau, employees may make complaints outside their chain of command. This helps to free employees from any fear of making a complaint, especially if the complaint is about someone in their chain of command. Another best practice, we finish investigations even if the employee who has been alleged to have engaged in misconduct leaves the police bureau. Sometimes, for example, employees will resign while an investigation is underway. The Portland Police continues the investigation to its end. Also, those involved in the investigative work, whether internal affairs or IPR, are separate from the process by which the corrective action and discipline are recommended. I mentioned this earlier. This separation is important as it helps to keep the investigative process from working specifically toward a particular end with regard to discipline. The investigators can focus on collecting and organizing evidence to summarize and present to fact finders who make recommendations regarding corrective action. And then speaking of corrective action, a best practice in that area, the Police Bureau utilizes a corrective action guide. Sometimes it's referred to as a discipline guide. This is a tool managers and members of the Police Review Board and the Chief's Office utilize when making recommendations or decisions on corrective action or discipline. The purpose of the guide is to offer accountability, clarity, consistency, to correct behavior, to improve community trust, and improve trust between the employees and their employer. The guide takes into consideration the severity and number of sustained allegations, as well as potential mitigating and aggravating circumstances or factors. The corrective action guide is a tool used only after findings are determined. The guide is not used to influence whether or not an employee's actions violated a policy. The guide features corrective action options that range from command counseling, mediation, remedial training, written reprimand, suspension without pay, loss of rank, termination, but also include education-based alternatives in lieu of varying amounts of suspension without pay. And that is a summary of the areas that we were asked to comment on. So I appreciate your time and attention allowing me to share a little bit about our process. Hopefully I provided you with some useful information, and hopefully I touched on the areas that, that we were asked specifically to speak about. Again, I would encourage you to review the directives relevant to our accountability system, which you can easily find online. And now the Professional Standards Division Commander, Jeff Bell, and I would be happy to try to answer some questions. I'm going to turn the camera off briefly as I rearrange it so I don't make anyone dizzy, but I'll just take about 10 seconds.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that presentation, that very thorough presentation. Amide, if you don't mind, can you pull up the slide deck? Thank you. We'll now take questions and let Captain Pashley and Commander Bell respond to them. Please keep your questions brief. Please allow me to facilitate this Q&A. And please ask questions that help the Commission move towards identifying barriers to police accountability and best practices, which is the purpose of this phase of work. So thank you, Amide. Really appreciate that. And am ready to call on Commissioner Simab and then Commissioner Lovisa. Go right ahead.
Greetings. Trying to lower my hand. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and grateful for your presentation. My question for either one of you, when it came to barriers to accountability, highlighted the lack of body-worn cameras or PWCs. Do you have any concerns to the barriers with body-worn cameras when it comes to access, transparency, and accountability? And have you looked into data and concerns that have been present about and behind body-worn cameras?
So neither one of us has been involved in the actual body-worn camera process right now. They're working on bargaining the policy regarding body-worn cameras. When I say they, Bureau Management is working on that with the union. I can say, like Greg mentioned, we do have some experience with that. We have a handful of vehicles that operate out of Central Precinct, which is downtown, that do have an audio visual camera and microphone system. And I think what we've both seen is it's really nice to have that kind of unbiased witness, essentially. I mean, video is not the be all end all, but it does provide another perspective. In reference to your question, I think some of the things you're asking about are some of the things that I know the Bureau is looking at are things like access to it via public records requests. There are issues regarding when officers should be able to review that. Again, that's not something either one of us have been involved with. So I can't speak to that, but I do know those things, those concerns, if I'm understanding your question correctly, those concerns are being looked at in terms of the public's access to that information through public records requests, privacy issues. Obviously, police officers are often placed in situations where we're talking to folks about very sensitive issues when it comes to things like domestic violence, sexual abuse, sexual assaults, those sorts of things. And so obviously we need to balance those sorts of concerns in terms of when officers actually activate their cameras and what information is then available to the public. We certainly wouldn't want some of those very sensitive sorts of interviews to be readily available to the public. So suffice it to say, I think all those things are being looked at. I just we don't have that. That's not part of what we're tasked with right now.
Thank you so much. Commissioner.
A quick follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So my thing is that that was the very first thing you guys brought up as a barrier to accountability and solving that was body-worn cameras, yet you guys aren't fully studied into the concerns behind accessibility, transparency, and accountability, and are telling us that you're not fully informed on that process. So it's a bit biased possibly, and not necessarily a significant barrier to accountability if you're not fully informed about it.
So I think what the commander was trying to get to is that in our office and professional standards, we haven't been tasked with the research and the considerations that you're talking about. The Bureau is doing that, just not in the professional standards division. We're not a part of that conversation. That's happening in other areas of our Bureau. There are offices and people who are involved in policy writing, research, and there are people within the Police Bureau working on, I think, the things that you're talking about. It just isn't the professional standards division. So I think there are people in the Bureau knowledgeable and engaged in conversations about this. It just isn't us. And nevertheless, we think that it's a tool that should be brought to bear to accountability. But we're not going to have direct input in the way that the Bureau brings it on board. We will work with it if and when that happens, under whatever our policies are regarding that specific tool.
But you do, but you guys say that a barrier to accountability is a lack of body-worn cameras. You're still behind that.
I think it is, sure. I think that's a barrier. The lack of body-worn cameras is a barrier.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Catherine. Because I see that Commissioner Lavisa lowered their hand. So,
okay, I was just wanting to
Catherine, yes.
I was wanting to be sure I wasn't jumping in front of her. Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Catherine McDowell, a member of the commission. I'm just trying to get my head around structurally the relationship between internal affairs and IPR. And, I hear you when you say it's a cooperative relationship, you guys work together on cases, share information and all of that. But I guess my fundamental question is, why do you need internal affairs if you have IPR, if you have civilian oversight? Why it's sort of sounded redundant to me. So I guess my first question is, what is it that internal affairs adds to that accountability picture that the civilian oversight that IPR provides does not, do without you guys there. So can you just help me understand the piece that you guys do sort of exclusively and best, and how that syncs with what IPR does?
Yeah, so the system has evolved over the years. Initially, when IPR was first created, I'm going to get the timeline. I'm probably not going to get the timeline entirely accurate, but when they were initially created, they were created simply to be the intake point, and they did not, whether or not they had the ability when they were first conceived, I don't know for sure, but at least as late as I want to say 2010 or 2012, they had the ability to do independent investigations. But prior to that, they were simply, all they did was do the intake. So they would do kind of a preliminary initial intake investigation to determine what the complaint was. And then they would go and refer that to IA if a full investigation needed to be done. So over the years, they have increased their budget, they've increased their staff, and they are still not at a staffing level where they can do full investigations of all of the cases that need to be investigated. So initially, and again, I want to say 2010 or 2012, I think was when they, I don't know for sure, I don't remember, but they started doing independent investigations about 10 years ago was when they started doing those. And again, they simply don't have the staff or the capacity to do full investigations. So IA does the majority of those. Like Captain Pashley talked about, there are certain cases that they are kind of the presumptive investigators on, primarily because of, I think, the public interest in some of those cases. And those include like high-ranking officers within the Bureau, crowd control, vulnerable complainants. And so IA does the primary work in terms of doing the full investigations. The other piece of the relationship is, so while IA does the bulk of the investigations, IPR approves all of our work. If they don't like how we have done a particular investigation, or they don't like how we have decided to handle a case, they have the ability to pull that back and do the investigation themselves. Does that kind of answer the question? We do the vast majority of the investigations.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Dan, your question.
Good evening, Commander and Acting Captain. I'm Dan Handelman. I use he, him pronouns, from the group Portland Cop Watch, but I'm here tonight as a commissioner on the Police Accountability Commission. I'm glad you brought up the question about internal politics and how the investigators aren't actively part of the rest of the Bureau now, and they don't have to work with the people they're investigating. But you're saying that most of them, and this is also a question that's in the chat, most of them are former officers. Would you say that most of them are former Portland officers? And can I just add to that, how hard do you think it is to find people who are not former law enforcement or former Portland officers to do the kind of work that you're trying to do and that IPR is trying to do? They don't.
So currently, I believe with 4 of the 8 are former Portland police officers.
Yeah, and that's right. That's the way I counted it up, just as you were asking, Dan. So half of our investigators came from elsewhere. Almost all of them had law enforcement. One did not. That investigator came out of a financial investigation background. Yes, so that, I think that answers your questions about the numbers. What was the second part of your question?
Oh, about getting, so
oh, yeah.
We actually, both Captain Pashley and I have sat on a number of interviews. I don't, I have to admit, typically I would actually prefer that they be outside agency or not have been associated with the Portland Police Bureau. That would just be my preference. I think it's extremely beneficial to have folks who are familiar with police work, but it's also beneficial to have folks who aren't familiar with individual people so that they can, I believe that lends itself to, it's not impossible, but I think it's easier to be more objective when you don't actually know the people that you're investigating. Most of the folks we have here who used to be Portland police officers are retired. Some of them retired for quite a while and have kind of moved past the point where they're investigating folks that they actually worked with. We've had a lot of turnover over the last, again, we have one investigator who's been here for 13 years. Anytime we have advertised this, we have, even though we don't require police experience, we've not gotten a ton of outside.
People outside law enforcement.
Yeah.
What we do ask or have in the times that I was involved in job postings that were put out to the world, we did desire investigative experience, including in-depth interview experience. And there are probably a variety of places where you can gain that sort of experience. Law enforcement happens to be one. And I think people are drawn to this outside if they've already left the profession in a sworn capacity, because it gives them a chance. This is what I've heard from applicants, to contribute in a different way. And to a person, they've all been interested in the accountability part of it and coming to bring their investigative experience to bear in a different way to serve. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, we'll try again.
Commissioner Monica.
Thank you. Thanks for coming and talking to us. This is super helpful. I'm one of the commissioners, and my question is, I think I've heard from both of you, admittedly, that this process is extremely complicated and confusing, and that is part of what is making, that is one of the barriers that you're identifying as barriers to accountability. So if you were to take away some of the confusing parts, what would they be? What parts do you need to get rid of to make this less confusing?
While you're thinking, Commander.
That's a really good question.
So while you're thinking of an answer, I'm going to give you not an answer, but just a struggle. So I was asked to come and be the acting captain in September because there was a need for someone to occupy the office, and I had a little experience from some years prior as a sergeant. But one of the things I thought about when I got here, even though no one was asking me, was how can we make this simpler? Is there a way that I can start to improve this process so that it is smoother? And I asked our staff, I talked to everybody in the office, and there were no ready answers. And part of that is because it has been built over years to meet a variety of needs, community concerns, directive changes, oversight from the US government, our settlement agreement. And so it's not something that someone like me can just come in, start looking around and making changes very simply. And so I don't have a good answer for your question, although I've asked that question. And I know in discussions with others in my office, there's this desire to, and I also don't know where else something exists that we could just adopt, for example, from another city, let's say, because each seems to grow up out of the needs of their own department, the needs of their own various communities that they serve, all the variety of interests that influence the way this process has been built over many years.
So I would say that, and I was thinking about that, the kind of like Greg alluded to, I think each of these individual complexities have arisen to fulfill some sort of need. One of the things that I think inside the police bureau, and obviously this is a structure that will probably no longer exist under, or could no longer exist under whatever plan you all put forward, but there are multiple levels of review. And again, I think that serves a purpose in that the more eyes you have on these investigations, the more people ask questions, the more we make sure that we answer all of those questions and we get a thorough complete investigation. However, that does add complexity. I think one of the complexities is just the variety of ways in which we take complaints in. And unfortunately, I also think that's a strength. We don't limit ourselves to, one or two particular processes that we say you have to do this to make a complaint. A lot of times we get lawsuits or tort claims from folks who have no interest in the complaint process. But if they are making a lawsuit saying that we did something wrong, we view that as a complaint. And again, so we have this system where there are all sorts of entry points into the system. It's complex. It I think is confusing to some people, but I think it also has benefits, which is why what you're asking is a great question, but it's really hard. And I think in reference to an earlier question, I think there is some redundancy between IA and IPR, but it's not necessarily redundancy in the work that's done. It's not like they're doing work and then we're doing that work over again. There's redundancy in terms of what functions we perform, but I think, and again, you all are looking at this in a way, in a holistic manner. I think having one organization that does all of those things all together is probably something that will, reduce the complexity and probably, without losing some of what that complexity brings to the system, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for those answers. I'm going to ask that Commissioner Lovisa, Jason, and Faith be our last three commissioners in this phase, because we do want to have time for public comment and public questions. So Commissioner Lovisa.
Sure. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Lovisa Lloyd. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a commissioner. I wanted to ask sort of budgetary questions. I did a quick Google, but I couldn't find quickly. I was curious if you happen to know Internal Affairs annual budget, sort of off the top of your head. And then if you could just tell us again roughly, you mentioned you have 8 civilian investigators, 3 admin folks, and then a few folks kind of at the leadership level. And I think really the root of my question is, how are you feeling about the budget that you have right now versus the caseloads that folks are seeing? And then I guess it kind of intersects a little bit with the question about IPR, where you've mentioned IPR doesn't really have the staffing right now to do full investigations. So you do most of the full investigations. And I guess that's sort of my question is, what is it that IA has that IPR does not have? Is it just a question of money? Is it a question of staff? What enlighten us a little bit more about how the budget interacts with all of this.
So you've asked a bunch of great questions. So I don't know off the top of my head what the budget is. The way our budget is structured, our budget is, I would say 90% of our budget, 95% of our budget is simply personnel costs. And so those are fixed. We get the money we need to pay for those personnel. And so again, I can't tell you off the top of my head. In terms of, so it's not so much what we have that IPR doesn't have, it's a difference in function. So IPR has a similar number of investigators, or at least I think they're
Might be down a little bit right
they're down a little bit right now, but I think they're authorized a similar number of investigators. They have a similar structure with about as many supervisory and management staff as we do. It's a little different, but their investigators spend a great deal of time doing intake investigations. So I'm not aware of what the current statistics are, but over the past 10 years, IPR does intakes. Currently, it's closer to maybe 200 complaints a year, but in the past, it's been pretty close to 400 complaints a year. And they end up administratively close a lot of those investigations that don't require a full investigation. They do a preliminary investigation. They're able to find out, that the complaint, even if true, a lot of them get closed because the complaint, even if true, is technically not misconduct. So that's what their investigators spend a lot of their time doing, is those preliminary investigations, kind of triage work. And so again, it's not so much what we have that they don't, it's that they've got a little bit of a different function. Occasionally when they're busy, we will do some intake work, but not nearly on the level of what they do. I mean, they do a preliminary investigation on just about everything that comes in through their door. They do some level of like talking to people, pulling records, looking at video evidence, whatever they may have. And so that takes time, and that requires, that just requires that person power to be able to do that. And so did I answer? You asked, like, it was a great multi-part. Did I get to everything?
Yeah, I think you did.
Okay.
Real quick, how many folks at the leadership level in IA?
So in IA, we have 2 sergeants who are like frontline supervisors, and then we have a lieutenant and a captain. And then over at IPR, they have like 1 lead investigator, and then they have, I think, kind of like the equivalent of a lieutenant over there. And then they have a director and an assistant director. So they have essentially 4 management and supervisory positions, and IA has 4. They're a little bit different just because of, again, the difference in the work they do. And I think they're authorized 7 investigators, something like that. So pretty similar staffing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Jason.
Thanks. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Greg. I'm Jason Renaud. I'm a member of the commission. My question is, I'm going to try to, thought Lovisa's question was really good. And I was interested to hear, Jeff, your thoughts about that maybe one operation would be more efficient and more effective. And so my question is, what parts of, or what investigations that Internal Affairs does now, do you think really could not be taken on by a civilian oversight board, as your understanding of what we're going to have now? We have a substantially larger budget than IPR, but what do you think this future board could not take on that IA currently does? Thank you.
That's a great question. And honestly, I can't answer that. What I can say is it's going to depend on the quality of investigators and the experience of the investigators that the oversight board, however that looks in the end, what that looks like. So yeah, I don't know if you have any comments on. I mean, again, without knowing what the structure is and what kind of staffing you're going to have, and if I remember right, I think it's tied to 5% of the police bureau's budget. So that is I believe that is substantially more than what IPR has. It's simply a matter of, I mean, if you hire people who have the right investigative experience, I mean, I don't know that there's anything you can't investigate, to be honest.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Commissioner Faith.
Hi, good evening. My name's Faith Aiken. I'm a commissioner, and thank you for being here. Last week we heard from Chief Lovell and Deputy Chief Frome, and one of the things we talked about was perhaps the level of discipline not being meaningful or really having consequence. So like a letter in a file or an unpaid day off may not really resonate of like, oh, this is a problem. And so I'm curious around your appetite for alternates to discipline. One of the things that we talked about was community service days. And also, so that's first part. And then it was really helpful for me to understand the distinction between IA and Professional Standards Division. And would you recommend that the investigative process and the discipline process remain separated as they currently are moving forward?
Yeah, so I'll answer your second question first because I think that's easier. Yes, I would recommend that. The issue is you don't want, this is from things I've read, from things I've seen, my own personal experience, you don't want it to appear that the investigation is being conducted in such a way as to derive a particular outcome. So keeping those functions separate helps to, I think helps to eliminate that, and it helps to eliminate the appearance of that. The investigation should be all about trying to figure out what happened. And, you know, when I was the captain here, I was the lieutenant here at NIA. Whenever we have new investigators, I mean, that is one of the first things I tell them. Your job here, your job is not here to get officers. Your job is not to protect officers. Your job is to do the best investigation so that we can provide decision makers with the best information to be able to determine what happened. I mean, and so I think it's really important that that investigative function, that what happened, what evidence is there, is separate from the how do we you know, do corrective action when we found that officers have engaged in misconduct. In terms of my appetite for different kinds of discipline, I will say I go back to what is the root of discipline. So we have officers, when we have some sort of corrective action, what are we trying to accomplish with that? What we're trying to accomplish, and you talk about, you know, you talked about whether or not a day off is impactful, or whether or not, you know, a letter in your file is impactful. I think the discipline needs to be something that, use your word, impactful, but it needs to be something that's going to change behavior. I would say that, you know, you have a couple of different kinds of misconduct. You have the misconduct where people are intentionally doing things that they know are wrong, and you have misconduct where people maybe didn't necessarily know what they were, didn't intend to violate rules, but they did. I think those are two different things, and I think a discipline system should recognize that in cases where officers maybe simply didn't have the appropriate training, then I think education-based alternatives, which is what our new corrective action guide calls them, can be very impactful and can be appropriate. When you have people that intentionally violate rules and do things, intentionally engage in misconduct, I can't speak for the chief or the deputy chief. I can speak for myself in that I think you need to do whatever you can to be impactful to that person, to let them know that it is not acceptable, and do whatever you can to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Because those sorts of things, I think, require something that is a little bit more extreme. So I think, again, I think it all comes from, what are you trying to do? You're trying to change employee behavior. You're trying to correct problems. And if you can do that with training, I think, again, if you can do it with training, then you should do it with training. If you can do that with, you know, mediation, if you can do that with, or if you need to go the severe punishment route, then ideally discipline is not punitive, but sometimes you have to go down that route. So I'm in favor of doing whatever it takes to ensure that the officers don't engage in that misconduct again, and go forward and learn something from it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, that's how I feel about it.
Thank you so very much for that. And these have been thoughtful questions and very thoughtful answers. I'm now going to ask that we take public comment on the issues discussed in this briefing. We ask members of the public to keep their comments or questions to 2 minutes in length at most, and raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to speak. I'll call on whatever order is preferred, but ensuring that people speak only once, and ideally the members of the public are prioritized over city employees and contractors. So we have a Q&A in a question and answer in the Q&A. And so I would love to invite Philip, if you would like to ask the second part of your question that is in the Q&A. I would invite you to speak that if you would like to.
Sure. My name is Philip Chachka. I use him, he, him pronouns. Thanks for coming. Yeah, as I'm concerned about having former police officers doing investigations. For me, I can see some conflicts of interest that might be there and some biases. And I was wondering how a new board oversight system might be able to oversee the investigators and maybe be involved in the hiring process of investigators, just to ensure that there's oversight and there's not there's maybe ways to test to make sure we're not being biased in favor of the police and against accountability.
Thank you so much, Philip. Really appreciate that. Greg?
Okay, is that a question for us? How
It's
the
a question
board?
for you as well as for the commission itself.
Okay. All I would offer is that anytime, if you're looking for investigators, I would just encourage whoever is seeking out investigators to have that be a high priority. Prior investigative experience, especially doing complicated cases and in-depth interviews. If you're looking for people who don't have law enforcement experience, there are other ways that people gain that experience, and I would just have that be a real important part of the background of the people that you're assigning to investigate complaints.
Thank you so much. That aspect of this work with the commission will be coming up in the 4th phase of this work. We're currently in the 2nd phase of this work, but we'll dig into this pretty deeply in the next few months around objectivity and put that in the garden plot for this evening. So thank you for the question, Philip. Thank you for the response. Commissioner Lavisa.
Sure, I just wanted to respond to Philip's question really quickly, which is looking at the charter language, section 2-1003 restrictions on board membership. It says pretty clearly, people currently employed by a law enforcement agency and their immediate family members are not eligible for service on the board. People who were formerly employed by a law enforcement agency are not eligible for service on the board.
Very good, very helpful. Thank you so much, Commissioner Lavisa. Commissioner Debbie.
So I wonder if that just applies to the board and not to the employees. So so I'm sure we'll have time to sort that out. I just was thinking, they may be two separate things, that if you're a appointed board member, you can't have that connection, but could be when they're hiring staff, maybe sometimes somebody who did used to work in law enforcement would be the right person to hire.
Thank you, Commissioner Debbie. So yes, again, remembering that we'll be able to speak to those particularly in phase 4. And making sure that we are going to go back into the public comment. Thank you. Are there any other individuals that would like to make public comment this evening, specifically to what's been presented? I do not see any hands raised. And so I am going to invite us to take a break. I'm going to invite us to take a break until 8:30, please. So we'll take a 10-minute break and return at 8:30. Thank you so very much. And thank you very, very much for coming this evening. We truly appreciate your expertise and your compassion and your passion for your positions and what you bring to the table. So thank you very much for presenting this evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Have a good night.
Good evening. Invite us to start the recording. So thank you so very much. Next on the agenda is a discussion of barriers to accountability and best practices in the current system. This is an open discussion, and we ask that you follow our normal discussion rules. Please be brief each time you speak, even though you can speak multiple times. Please be facilitated And remember that we are now using a weighted stack in our discussions. Finally, please be forward-looking in your comments. I would love the co-chairs to frame our discussion and then get started, please.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Faith Aiken, she, her pronouns. So tonight as we've been doing, we're going to talk about some of the barriers that we heard. I will note some of the barriers that were brought up this evening. I'm really curious to what resonated with you all. We heard that the process is confusing. A lot of people don't know how it works, that there's many points of entry, many different streams or paths for each case, and that the system has been built and adapted so many times over years. That the length of time that an investigation is open is long due to complications. I was really curious, he used, I'm sorry, acting captain used the phrase openness of process, which I took as like the length of time that the process is open as a barrier. And finally, a lack of understanding of the process. He identified that this could give the impression that accountability is not happening at all. And then finally, CMOB, your question around their first point was around lack of body cameras being used. So I'm curious what other commissioners heard or what resonated with you all.
Commissioner Lavisa.
Sure. Do we want to start as like barriers conversation first and then best practices second? Okay, so barriers, yeah, just agreeing with a lot of what you said. Faith, the process is confusing and labyrinthine. There are many paths. It takes a long time. It's frustrating to both employees and complainants, and the lack of transparency is not satisfying. Like those were some areas that I had that just totally agreed, I think, with what you just said. Some other barriers I had were the complainants are not empowered to participate, was sort of like my reading of something that was said. Of course, they can choose not to participate, but it sounds like they're not in particularly like enabled or empowered to participate. Oh, and also that evidence is spoiled sometimes because investigations take a long time, or may need to be possibly redone. Also under barriers, I had that IPR. This is something we'd sort of talked about a little bit more towards the end, but that IPR is not at a staffing level sufficient to do full investigations, even though they are apparently sort of like the investigator of record or the automatic investigator for certain types of investigations, which I thought was interesting. Oh yeah, well, and I guess maybe kind of the greater barrier on that might be that no one office it has sufficient capacity to handle all aspects of the process, and that seems to be why we have so many different agencies and organizations each doing a part of the process, because it really sort of sounded like IA and IPR, they work in tandem essentially, and one group is doing one thing, another group is doing another thing. So no one having sufficient staff, money, resources, access to do it all.
Any other thoughts? Again, we're agreeing, disagreeing, saying some things multiple times will really help you in the future, coming back and looking at these things. So Commissioner Debbie.
Sorry. So, when he talked about the openness and transparency, and that's one thing right now, the way we do have some level of transparency through the IPR when there's an appeal. That happens in the open. We can go and watch and learn from that. But I'm really curious, and I don't know if there's any expert we can invite to come and talk to us about designing a system that has the most transparency and openness possible, given the fact that this is, these are personnel issues. So yeah, so that's something that I just, I don't know how you do that. And it'd be interesting to know if there's somebody out there who can tell us that it is possible to have these parts of the process open for public observation. And going back and then talking about the complainant, I feel like he was also saying, you file your complaint and then at the end you get a letter that says what happened, but it doesn't tell you very much. And there's not a whole lot that in the middle. And so that's obviously something that hopefully the one we design can be improved in the sense that even if we can't have things open, at least maybe we can have some really, kind of comprehensive updates for the complainant, from start to finish. So those are my thoughts right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Debbie. And I would suggest that they go into the garden plot, that those two suggestions go into the garden plot. One about designing a system with transparency. And then what was the second suggestion? I'm sorry, Debbie.
Oh, you remember he talked about how complainants feel like it's like just a whole, so maybe, building in some really regular updates. For the complainant, yeah. So they know what's going on. It takes 6 months, but maybe every month they get a really good update on here's where we are, and yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that. Commissioner Sophia.
Well, good evening. I had some partial comments on some of the things that people have already mentioned, and one was the IPR's investigative process. When I was looking at their regulations, it appears that IPR can only investigate in certain types of issues. They can't do all of them. So I thought that might be a barrier. I don't know what it's going to look like in the future. We haven't gotten that far yet, but we might want to look into that to see if there's a way to open that up. Because if I remember correctly, I'm just looking at it on the internet really quick. They're only allowed to look at crowd control, disparate treatment, or retaliation against a community member, vulnerable or mentally ill persons, sworn members of the rank of captain or higher, in cases in which IPR disagrees with the IA captain's processing or assignment decision. And then there's last one, matters that the IPR director determines are in the public interest and over which IPR has jurisdiction under the city code. So I'm just looking at that and I'm thinking that might be a barrier. I don't know what we want to do in the future, but I know it's limited as to what IPR can do. And in addition, there's another barrier, IPR, and I'm not sure if it's a barrier or not because we didn't get into that. IPR has the right to do the investigations. This is according to the regulations, with being the lead. And how often does that happen? And how can we prevent, I guess, internal affairs interfering? It says that internal affairs can assist and they can ask them to assist, but I was just wondering how that can, I'm just thinking that could be messy at points. So those are my comments for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other comments? Especially agreeing, disagreeing. Commissioner Faith?
Yeah, I need to think out loud and ask this question among my colleagues of the way that it was making sense to me. So I mentioned to you that I participated in grand jury duty, and so grand jurors hear the evidence from the district attorneys and just only hear the evidence from district attorneys, and then grand jurors make the decision, do we have enough evidence to indict? and then an indictment goes forward, and then the jury decides, are they guilty or not? They hear from the defense and they hear from the district attorney, and then talk about sentencing. And in my mind, in some ways, like we're mirroring a process, or that has been what's come up tonight for me. And the reason why I asked the question about keeping them separate is, as we're considering community oversight, I'm really wanting to understand like how much of the barrier is like the investigative process, and how much of the barrier is the disciplinary action process. And I don't know that only last week were we able to really like talk about the disciplinary action process. And so I'm curious if other commissioners have thoughts on that, or resources, because that's something that I don't feel like I really understand.
Thank you, Commissioner Faith. Commissioner Dan, and then Commissioner Sophia.
Yes, thank you. Well, just addressing what Commissioner Aiken was just saying, the design that's in the charter shows there are going to be professional staff investigators and then community board members. And the community board members are going to be the ones deciding on the discipline. So that's already kind of laid out as separated for what we're working on. So I feel like that we're in kind of good shape already on that question. There are issues right now, and we're going to save these for when the police review board comes to talk to us very soon, but about how there are decisions being made about whether or not an officer is guilty of misconduct based on what the discipline might be. That's not happening in internal affairs, it's happening in that police review board. So that's why I didn't bring it up with them tonight. Going back to the body cams issue, one of the things that they didn't discuss, even though Commissioner Hussaini was trying to push them, and Co-Chair Hussaini, sorry, was trying to push them really hard on it, is that body cameras point outward from police officers, so they don't record what the police officers are doing. So it's, it may add something. I'm glad they were actually careful about how they said it. It will add something, but it's not the be all and end all. We have talked for many years about moving investigators out of internal affairs to the IPR, so that the budget from the police bureau would be shifted instead into well, a week and a half from now be an independent office. But as I posted in the chat, the new board's going to have 5%, the equivalent of 5% of the police bureau's budget. So that's going to be helpful for some of the issues that came up, I think. But I think one of the issues that Philip was bringing up in his Q&A and in his question has to do with community trust. And the big issue, and one of the reasons I feel like they don't always get complainants to work with them, is that, and when they find out that they're talking to an employee of the police bureau investigating their problem with a police officer, they just go, I'm not doing this. So that's why the IPR is supposed to have this independent investigation ability, and why I was kind of focusing on trying to find more investigators who aren't former police. And they did say they have one, and that they admit that anybody who's good at investigating can investigate anything. So I think that's helpful in terms of what we're going to be looking at later down the line. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Dan. Commissioner Sophia, and I'm suggesting that this be the last question, comment, thought, so we can go to public comment. Commissioner Sophia.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to comment on Faith's question or her thought process. One of the things that I'm not sure how it works is the interaction when they're doing their investigations, say with, I'm just going to use some lethal force or excessive force kind of cases, when they're working with the coroner's office, who's talking to these people, and what is that relationship with the police bureau? There's a coroner's office, and I can't think of the coroner's office, and I can't remember the other term, but anyway, they're two different positions sometimes. How much information do they get, and how transparent is that? I mean, when I say transparent, is there any pressure? It just seems that no one's ever able really to talk to those, folks except the police. So does the internal affairs people go first? Or is it the police bureau or the police chief? I'm just wondering, when they're investigating, how they get access, who they're getting access to, and are there any kind of influences, like Dan was saying, maybe the people who don't want to identify themselves because the police are involved, and I don't know. I'm just wondering if that's a barrier to some of the information that they get, who they're talking to, and the influences that may or may not be in that process. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Sophia. I just wanted to draw your attention to the budgets that our support staff has put into the chat. So that is helpful to know about the budgets that are current and then could be future budgets. And so I would like us to move forward into public comment about anything this evening. And I am lost. Here we go. We'll now take public comment on the issues the PAC is discussing, or community members can also tell their story about policing or police accountability. We ask members of the public to keep their comments or questions to 2 minutes in length, and raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to speak. I'm not seeing any hands raised in the public. So sorry, Philip, please. Philip, please step into the room. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for having me. I just wanted to say that I would like, as an option, just to think about how a new board might be able to be responsible for the hiring of their own investigators who look into this, and so they can make hiring decisions of what type of investigators they want, and maybe have a better selection of not just former police officers that would help build public trust. That's all I'd like to say.
Thank you so much for your comments. Anyone else? Thank you so much. We will go to Commissioner Faith.
Thank you, Dr. Moses. There's just a couple of comments in the chat and I want to give you a hand. So
yes,
thank you so much, support staff. Just want to read out that IPR's budget for 22-23 is nearly $3 million at $2,970,881. The oversight board will have at least 5% of police bureau's budget. The 22-23 budget for PPB is $249,129,763. So if we were to do the math, 5% of that would be $12,456.48. And then a couple of other questions. Debbie had some parking lot suggestions around process. So adopting a process related to editing and granting final approval for letters sent by the commission. And the second, how can we follow up with city council or other decision makers on letters the commission sends to them? Jason asked the question, if the future board takes on the tasks of the PPB-IA, what cost savings will be accrued by PPB?
Thank you so much, Commissioner Faith. I really appreciate that. Yes, Commissioner Lavisa, we should also take a look at, I think we did a really good review around barriers, but we didn't do a good review around best practices. So I would like to give us another 5 to 7 minutes around best practices. If you would like to have a conversation around that. I apologize that I'm out of sync here, but I think we can manage this. Commissioner Monica.
Hi, I was surprised when they said that their preference would be for the process to not be part of the PPB. And if that's what they say, okay. I think that's interesting, and I would like to put that in the record one more time so that we make sure that we do that.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Monica. Commissioner Lavisa.
Thank you, Commissioner Monica, for noting that. Something I had written down as best practice is that information sharing between organizations involved, assuming that there are multiple organizations involved, and I think that definitively there definitely will be at least 2. There will be the board and there will be PPB, but having strong information sharing practices. I think that also goes to the level of the organization itself doing the investigations. They mentioned investigators frequently consult with each other, share information, share knowledge, team up, and that is something that has been working really well. I thought that sounded like just a good idea. Also, I think we've mentioned this before, but the fact that the case can be sent back at any point for more work by investigators. And also something obviously that they mentioned that's really significant and really important, something that I'm sure we'll talk about a lot later, is that all of the investigators have prior investigative experience into sensitive, complex, and confidential matters, and in particular that they have in-depth interview experience. And of course, it's a nice bonus or plus if they're like familiar and knowledgeable with police policies, union contracts, other methods and trends in that type of work. Investigators make recommended findings for later to fact finders, since they are the ones who know the most about the investigation. They finish the investigations even if the subject has resigned. And something we've talked about already, that there is separation of investigation and imposition of discipline or corrective action. And just a small aside, something that they noted is that the multiple sets of eyes seems to be really helpful. Multiple rounds of review for a case, something I think CRC brought up as well.
Thank you, Commissioner Lavisa. Commissioner Christian.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. I had 2 comments. One, sorry, I'm getting a random call. Let me hang that up, sorry. Distracted me for a second. One was, I noticed that when we were going through the best practices, they mentioned that thorough investigations were something that they considered a best practice. I thought that was interesting because it seems like a double-edged sword, because they also talked about how the really complex nature of the system leads to that thorough investigation, but at the same time causes some of that complexity that makes it really difficult to understand the system. I think that's something that we should flag. That's something we might have to we're going to have to work through that, because it seems like that's something that's really good, but also causes some of the issues that we've been discussing. And then the other comment that I had, I completely forgot. Sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you.
Not a problem. We're all human. And you can put it in the chat if you like, if it comes back to you. And into the garden plot. Yes, that would be great. Commissioner Monica.
One other thing, they talked about the quality of their investigators as a best practice. But for me, that kind of triggers a little bit of a fright response. The fact that, you know, police staff or an agency in police is asking questions in a way that an investigator would seems pretty triggering to me. So I would like to kind of dig into that a little bit more. So I was just having that thought.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Christian and then Commissioner Dan.
Hi, thank you. I remembered it. It was similar to what Commissioner Monica was saying. I agree with that. And I think my addition that I was kind of thinking, my version or variation of that was, I think, not just looking for the background in investigative experience or whatever, but maybe setting aside some of the budget for training as well, because I think if you just look for a specific, that will bring a certain type of person or certain type of background. I think it would be good to get lots of different perspectives, even people who may not have that experience, but maybe be able to train them somehow. Or like Monica was saying, kind of rethinking what that really looks like in the first place. It's just kind of a conversation I think we should have. They were talking a lot about like looking for people with that kind of background, but I think it's possible to also have a training process. Yeah, I'll stop repeating myself, but thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Dan, you're going to wrap us up this evening.
Woohoo!
And then we're going to go to next steps in the garden plot.
Commissioner Glenn brought up before something that made me realize they did not really address internal affairs participation in investigating deadly force cases, which is really too bad. But one of the reasons that IPR cannot, that's the only kind of case really IPR cannot investigate because it's in the police association contract, and they didn't pull it out this year when they renegotiated the contract. So that's going to have to be fixed before the new board goes into place. But I think, the charter says that the new board can investigate deadly force. Another thing is the specific backgrounds of people that are there could also be a turnoff to people who are being investigated. And I'm saying this specifically, and I didn't want to bring this up while he was still here, but I've known Commander Bell for many, many years, so he's heard me say this in public in front of his face a lot of times. But he was responsible for the death of Jose Mejia Pote, day laborer in 2001. He actually shot Mejia Pote in a mental hospital in that year. And then he shot at another person named Eddie Homsenbath a few years later, who supposedly took his own life. So knowing that, there's a lot of people, I think, that when they see Commander Bell at a meeting, they're saying, why is this person in charge of internal affairs and investigating what police might have done wrong? So just something to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm going to move into our next section here. It's time for us to summarize any items that are brought up today which didn't fit into today's agenda. We'll recap those items here and use them in developing future agendas. We won't be using the time to add new ones or previously mentioned ones, but we will use this list to develop future agendas so that the items can be discussed. So Aimide, would you please report back what you have captured for us this evening?
Yes. Okay, let's see. You guys had a lot of goodies. The first I got was the things that you'll be putting or that are in the garden plot are like the distinctions of who will be serving on the commission created by the Portland Police Accountability Commission versus who will the commission hire. So the question will be, will former police officers or law enforcement be allowed to work for the commission or serve on the commission? The second thing that I got on here was take on the task of it was based off of Commissioner Jason's comment, take on the task of PBB, or Portland Police Bureau in Internal Affairs, asking what cost savings will be accrued by PBB. Sorry, I'm like, my notes are looking kind of scribbly. Basically, if you guys take on the responsibility, what would the savings would be by PBB? I think I'm saying that right. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner Dan. Commissioner Jason. And then I have designed a system with the most transparency possible. Design a regular updated system for the person making the complaints throughout the investigation. And then to discuss the complexities of the investigation, to help reveal criminal conduct that would take over police investigation for a new oversight board. And would police take over the investigation of a new oversight board? So those are the things I have, and forgive me if they're a little bit confusing.
Amide, thank you so very much. There's also one in the chat.
Thank you.
From the community. The police misconduct complaint reveals criminal misconduct. Yeah. Would the police take over the investigation from a new oversight board? So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Staff, are there any other additions that we should make?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I would like to bring our meeting to an end. Thank you all to the members who attended today's meeting and for your contributions today. Thank you also to the interpreters supporting access to the meeting of the Police Accountability Commission and its subcommittees for all Portlanders. Thank you to our briefers for coming and spending their time sharing their thoughts with the commission and the public. Finally, thank you to the members of the community for attending and contributing your thoughts and questions. You can give advance public comment prior to future meetings at tinyurl/PortlandPAC comment. You can also sign up for email updates on the PAC's work at tinyurl.com/PortlandPAC updates. It's now 9:03 and this meeting is adjourned.